Mechanics convey meanings. What do I mean by that? In Eco, you are playing a child, cast into obscurity for being born with horns, and it uses mechanics to convey a specific sequence of meanings. You are a disempowered kid, so you are hard to control. When you stumble across the Princess Yorda, the isolated context makes you appreciate her companionship in this harsh world. Forcing us to hold down a button to guide her around simulates intimacy, and stripping away a traditional health bar and tying our well-being to hers is an ingenious way to make us act selfless. Eco was somewhat revolutionary when it came out, inspiring games as varied as Dark Souls to Prince of Persia, but what it showed clearer than most was how you could use interactivity to convey specific meanings, sometimes deliberately at the expense of player agency. Let's broaden the scope here. Journey is a game that is meant to parallel the hero's journey of Joseph Campbell fame, and it uses mechanics to convey these themes. Getting the scarf at the beginning of the game is a power-up in some sense, but here it is meant to emulate that step in the hero's journey where you receive the boon to face your adventure. A slow, plodding pace in the early sections gives way to the free-flowing cadence of the sand-surfing section, emulating the road of trials and joy, which is then quickly followed by fear in the belly of the whale as you avoid menacing enemies, then adversity on your way to the top of the mountain as your movement is severely restricted. Finally, you are given the ability to fly, and this relatively mobile sensation replicates resurrection, transcendence, and apotheosis as you journey to the peak. Additionally, when you meet players through the game, your abilities improve, suggesting that to be around others is in fact enlivening and transformative, and this all culminates in a conclusion, spoiler alert, where you return to the beginning of your journey, ready to pass your received wisdom to a new generation. Eco and Journey are the most cited examples when it comes to meaningful mechanics, because they were built around their themes. Fumito Ueda leverages a design philosophy called design by subtraction, where he removes anything that doesn't reinforce the core theme. That game company starts with a theme and then leverages the tools of interactivity to convey that message. The clarity of how intimacy, joy, fear, love, vulnerability, hardship, and resurrection are conveyed makes these games great examples. But we have an entire medium full of games that have used mechanics in different ways to convey different meanings. It can be very difficult to explain how games convey specific metaphors, but I feel we need to start building a library of these meaningful mechanics if we want to push the medium forward. The definition of mechanic I'll be using here is rather broad, and is contained in the book Game Mechanics: Advanced Game Design. It can be the simple physics of movement and its animation, like how movement and Eco and Journey convey meaning. It can be an internal economy element, like a health bar, or any number of other resources from lives to power-ups to boost bars. It can be a social element, like how being close to one another improves your abilities in Journey. Additionally, things like victory conditions, point systems, objectives, framing, context, fail states, and fun all actually encode different meanings. Having victory in a real-time strategy game be actualized through combat valorizes combat. The point system of Tony Hawk says it is good to be creative and risky, and the fact that killing is not fun in Spec Ops and is framed as a schizophrenic sojourn into the heart of darkness encodes that what we are doing is perhaps not ideal. Finally, two more frameworks can help us flesh out our conceptual language. Jonathan Blow talks about dynamical meaning in this talk, the main conflicts in modern game design, which is the idea that we should respect the intrinsic meaning that emerges from rules. He urges designers to tie the mechanics of a game to its fiction, something he does in his games. For example, Braid uses time manipulation mechanics in its gameplay, so its story is about regret, change, and redemption. In his book, Persuasive Games, Ian Bogost introduces us to the term procedural rhetoric, which is the idea that we can use the mechanics of games to persuade people about an idea. Missile Command reads as an anti-nuclear parable because it is stressful to protect multiple cities from the bombardment of nuclear weapons. It forces you to make sacrifices, and then it ends with an inevitable failure, encoding futility. With that being said, there are also potentially light spoilers for every example I bring up, so please skip past individual sections if you want to avoid them. Never Alone is a game that was conceived with the intent of preserving the Inupiat tribe's stories and traditions, and it uses mechanics to convey some of their ideas. It's a cooperative game between a girl and her fox friend, a spirit animal, and the cooperation here shows the relationship between the Inupiat and their animals. To reinforce the core idea of how you are never alone, despite the fact you are isolated, there are these sections where your ancestors will emerge from the ether to help you in your platforming, signifying through interactivity how your ancestors will always take care of you, and their worldview about interconnectedness and compassion. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is a game of a similar cooperative mold, and it documents the journey of two boys as they voyage to find a cure for their ailing father. The game forces you to play both brothers simultaneously, each controlled by a different analog stick, and the tension in trying to control both and solve puzzles is the virtual equivalent of patting your head and rubbing your belly. However, the meaning encoded here is of the conflict between the brothers, who don't get along at the start, and your familiarization with the controls symbolizes their coming together, using your brain as a metaphor in some sense. Using conflict in counterintuitive ways is something the game Florence did recently. It's a game about a girl falling in love with a guy, but it uses a pastiche of light interactive elements to reinforce specific emotions. On your first date, the conversation between the two is represented by simple matching puzzles, but as the date goes on, the puzzles become easier, telling us that they are coming together. In another part of the game, when your bow is moving in, you have to figure out which of your things you want to get rid of, and the indecision implicit in figuring out what to get rid of simulates the actual compromises one needs to make when you are in a relationship. I don't want to spoil any more, and the game is only 30 minutes long, so go play it, but it uses devices like these through the game to convey a variety of emotions. Love is a severely overlooked theme in games, but it seems clear that we are building a more robust vocabulary around it. In another one of Fumito Ueda's games, The Last Guardian, the unresponsive nature of your giant companion makes him feel like an actual pet. And there have been studies to show that taking care of something, in addition to it being a burden to interact with, actually creates a bond. Another device the game employs is to show how much your companion loves you through interactivity. All through the game, Trico is deathly afraid of these stained glass ornaments, but later in the game, when you are potentially being captured, he jumps into the fray to protect you despite his fear, an honest signal of the affection he now bears for you. My sense is that players were genuinely attached to Trico for these reasons. Pet simulator games The Sims and even Heavy Rain use mundane and burdensome activities to get you to be more familiar and intimate with either your avatar or a companion in-game, leveraging interactivity to create a parity or attachment between us and a virtual character. Thomas Was Alone was an explicitly symbolic game that was very smart about how it used interactivity to convey meanings. Each of the blocks has a different personality based on their shape, size, color, and abilities. This shape is long, tall, and can leap much further than the others, and so is a show-off, whereas this one is short and relatively incapable, so he is bitter and feels inadequate. By manipulating the environment and showing how each archetype has a place, the game shows us how context changes the utility of different abilities. Additionally, the interdependency of the mechanics by game's end tells a Jungian story about integrating different aspects of our psyche, and the game manages to sustain love stories, tragic arcs, and even overcoming depression, just by using the meaning in simple mechanics and the power of narration. Narration was also used in games like the Stanley Parable to play with the relationship between narrator and narrated, showing how your actions, however agentic, can always be predicted and incorporated into a game's fiction, making you question the very idea of free will itself. However, let's examine a game that had similarly vague symbolic cues as Thomas Was Alone. In Tetsuya Mizoguchi's abstract music game Res, you play as a humanoid avatar traveling through a synesthetic cyberspace, but the game needs to be read symbolically to uncover its true meaning. The synesthesia of your surroundings symbolizes being in the womb before you were born, where our perceptions were undifferentiated. The escalating music, and the fact your avatar evolves as you do better, symbolizes evolving towards our higher selves, precipitated by cleansing the network of viruses. The viruses symbolize misinformation, so the game is encoding a meaning about knowing ourselves and our past, represented by the civilizations you travel through in wireframe form. We are traveling towards Eden, a symbol for rebirth, making the game a parable about cycles and evolution, and it uses the difficulty of attaining 100% completion as a metaphor for how hard it is to do this properly. Exploring ours and our avatar's subconscious is something games can do extremely well, and there have been some excellent uses of mechanics in this realm. In Catherine, you are playing a man who has to decide between two women in his life, and the anxiety inherent in this decision is symbolized by these absurd time-constrained puzzles that you do while he's asleep, using it to represent his subconscious demons. Hellblade is a game that tries to simulate the plight of a woman suffering from schizophrenia, and it uses a wide array of tools to convey this. Puzzle solving requires you find patterns in the environment, making you search through bland environments as if there were meaning there when there isn't. The game uses binaural audio to simulate the voices inside her head, and it creates this harrowing representation of her mind by using symbolic motifs and haunting enemy design. However, the best thing they did, spoiler alert, was to lie to the player. At the beginning of the game, it tells you that a certain number of deaths will lead you to have to start again. This was actually not true. You, the player, didn't know this, and so you feel the same sense of paranoia and dread, not knowing what is real or not, as someone suffering from schizophrenia, a brilliant use of mechanics and interactivity to create empathy for another. This incensed lots of gamers though, not privy to the artistic license the developers gave themselves to tell a story. Much like Hellblade, games like Dark Souls and Celeste recognize the hardship intrinsic to challenge in games and build stories around this theme. Celeste uses its extremely difficult puzzle platforming to tell a story about overcoming anxiety and depression, but its assist mode and melancholy but triumphant music helps ease players through this hardship, telling a meta-narrative about how it is we overcome. Dark Souls does something very similar, by letting you level up, solicit the aid of others, and keep trying to perfect the formula. It guides you towards conquering your demons, all while creating a fiction about resisting the depletion of your will in the form of hollowing. Another game that leverages difficulty brilliantly is Devil May Cry 3. It tells a Cain and Abel type story between two brothers, and the fact that your encounters with Virgil are the most difficult in the game heightens the narrative tension during these boss battles. Devil May Cry also encodes meanings in different ways. The Style Meter, a mechanic that rewards creative play with extra points and orbs, incentivizes you to act like a creative trickster, aligning you with Dante in some sense. Also, reading the symbolism elsewhere reveals the game to be much deeper than it seems. The tower you are climbing is a rendition of the Tower of Babel, built by humans to reach to the heavens, except you are playing as a demon, associating demonic imagery with ascendancy. The game is a deconstruction between the line dividing good and evil, and Dante's awakening happens when he gets the power-up, his demonic form, an inversion of the scarf thing in Journey. Your movement through the tower is metaphorical for an inverted hero's journey as well, like how after you are defeated by Virgil for the first time, you find yourself in the literal belly of a whale, a plotting section that makes you contemplate what just happened. And this is a metaphor for the stage in the hero's journey of the same name, where a hero resurrects after a death. On the subject of subverting good and evil, Spec Ops: The Line uses more clear-cut imagery to represent your descent into madness by getting you to keep moving downward through a level. Additionally, it uses ambiguous moral decisions, framing, and color correction to insist to you that evil does not lie out there somewhere, it exists in the hearts of all men and women. This subversive inversion was used by Shadow of the Colossus as well, which can be seen as an interactive version of Moby Dick, just as Spec Ops was Heart of Darkness. When you fell a beast, haunting funereal music plays, and your character is seen to be corrupted with every monster he fells. Leveraging complicity is something games can do extremely well, and something Papers, Please executes brilliantly. It makes you decide between letting innocent people across a border and feeding your family, showing how the obligations and responsibilities we have as people often coerce us into doing perverse things. The neuroscientist Jack Panksepp described 7 subcortical circuits which he believed cause all mammals to experience certain emotions, and these emotions are play, grief, rage, fear, lust, seeking, and caring. Understanding the variety of emotions enabled by our psychological substrate can allow us to think of new ways of expressing these emotions through mechanics. Our play circuitry is activated when we are engaged in an activity with another in creative and frivolous action, something leveraged by cooperative games like Overcooked or even collaborative creative platforms like the upcoming Dreams. Grief is activated when you feel a loss of something you previously depended on, and this is effectively what Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons did. Rage is an evolutionary adaptation that most likely arose to make us force the environment to conform to our desires, and it is also activated when people perceive injustice. Difficult games leverage rage strategically to heighten a sense of triumph, but we can also invoke this to activate people's moral instincts in trying to kill a horrible antagonist or reverse the injustice of certain things. Horror games invoke fear beautifully by limiting the player's resources and making them feel utterly disempowered. Seeking is the circuitry that drives most games, as it is the reward system that mediates anticipation and learning. And caring can be seen in games where you have to look after someone or something, and I've already highlighted a variety of games in this vein. Understanding the mechanics that invoke certain emotions gives us a more robust understanding of how mechanics enable certain player experiences, and this is only the beginning of this domain of exploration. There are many more nuanced emotions that our symbolically inclined minds can conjure, from hope to redemption to euphoria and contempt, and I'm certain we can realize these emotions in inventive ways as the medium evolves. The examples I've given so far are all fairly clear, I hope, as well as being the express intention of the developers who devised them. But now I want to move into more abstract and distributed forms of meaning. What do I mean by this? Will Wright once said SimCity was influenced by a book by Jay Forrester on urban development. So in some sense, the game encodes a system in its play space. However, values inevitably seep into these systems, like how urban decay and a pro-public transit stance is encoded by mechanics that reveal the problems of overpopulation and how public transport is more efficient. The game Everything is meant to be the systemization of Alan Watts' monist philosophy, the idea that everything is interconnected. So the game allows us to explore this wonder by moving through different degrees of scale to another. I'll be delving into fully distributed meaning in another video, but here I want to focus on how mechanics enable the realization of a broader vision. Take Mafia 3 for example. You are playing a mixed-race war veteran in 1960s New Orleans, and it encodes some of the ideas of the times in its mechanics. As a black individual, committing a crime in a white neighborhood actually leads to the police responding quicker, whereas doing so in a black neighborhood elicits a less severe response. This subtly reinforces some of the broader themes of the story and setting. Similarly, Assassin's Creed Liberation lets you play as a mixed-race woman who can switch costumes between a slave and an upper-class woman. Depending on what costume you are wearing, the elements and people of the world respond to you differently, encoding the variety of phenomenological realities of people just based on what class you are in or how others perceive you, and just think of how this can be expanded to a whole variety of different ideas. Bioshock's overarching theme is about the relationship between freedom and control. Nier Automata's is existentialism, and Metal Gear Solid 2's is about information control, choice, and postmodern inversions. And each of these games uses mechanics at a low level of resolution to reinforce its broader points. Bioshock gives you agency in choosing abilities and strategies, has contrived moral choices that many argue actually conflict with the themes, and also has a meta-narrative structure to highlight this conceit that I won't spoil. Nier Automata uses the language of games brilliantly in its fiction, whether it be death, multiple playthroughs, or even minor mechanical cues like the shifting camera angles in the de Beauvoir boss fight that encodes a meaning about vanity through interactivity.
Get back. Keep it busy. You got it.
Metal Gear Solid 2 is about infiltration, so you use stealth. It is anti-war, so it actually allows and encourages a non-lethal playstyle. But this is just a superficial reading. It uses the medium language like Nier, the meta-narrative antics of Bioshock, but also reinforces its core theme in everything from the writing of the characters, to the environment, to the mechanics. I'm going to spoil a detail from the Vamp boss fight, so be warned. In this fight, you fight this supernatural fiend who seems to be able to warp around the room, and in the fiction of the story, he can read the muscle movements of characters so as to anticipate their actions. When playing the fight, if you use the auto-aim feature, you can't actually hit him. The only way to succeed is to use manual aim. Think about that. Not only does it work in the fiction, it is saying how we need to exercise manual agency to thwart the instincts of a character who can read automated movements, showing how we need to make our own choices and actions to succeed, a detail that reinforces the whole thematic overlay of the game with one minor mechanical maneuver that many might have missed. When we dig deeper into the spatial and mechanical interface of a game, there are meanings that developers are rarely even aware of encoded in their games. In this GDC talk by Matt Haggis, he argues even abstract games like Tetris encode a plot, as they present a series of escalating challenges. The blocks get faster, for example, and the point system valorizes a certain kind of creative and risky play. Escalating tension is what most stories from across media are about, and games can use this fact to communicate any number of story templates. The Tetris effect actually layered this ludic language onto a heroic symbolic structure to tell a story about humanity's creative journey through the intrinsic mechanics of Tetris. Now, think about how Tetris and Pac-Man end in inevitable failure. Are these now tragic stories? But we resurrect every time we die. So is this a Sisyphean parable about repetitious futility, an Eliadian tale of acting out cycles to become as gods, an Aristotelian tale of cathartic redemption, or a Nietzschean parable about saying yes to life? Now think about this. If our objective is to kill a monster like in Mario, this is a monster hunting quest like Theseus and the Minotaur. However, if we frame this as bad, this becomes Moby Dick or Shadow of the Colossus. Think about the meaning is encoded by the subtle spatial structure of games, and there are no shortage of things we can communicate with mechanics. The developer Soren Johnson has written about how despite the fact the surface layer of Mario is about plumbing, the real meaning of the game is about timing and coordination. In some sense, we can read games in three ways. We can read them in its fictional language, we can read it in its ludic language, or we can read it in its psychological language. This is where things get very confusing, so bear with me. But the reason for this, I think, is that games can be interpreted as enclosed worlds, interactive systems, or devices for play, and the resolution we view a game from alters the meaning of its mechanics. For example, Battlefield is about war and a soldier's experiences in its fiction. However, looking at the game's meaning through its ludic language reveals it to be a hero's journey in the single player, and a parable about zero-sum war in the multiplayer. Psychologically though, it's about the systems, incentives, strategies, and abilities you need to leverage and exhibit to succeed, so the metaphor in the game is one of cooperation. Call of Duty, on the other hand, by being more friendly to lone wolves through the use of kill streaks and lone gun tactics, encodes a value of the heroic individual soldier, and in some sense, that's actually what Call of Duty's plots tend to be about. The reason we read games this way is articulated in Ralph Koster's book, A Theory of Fun, where he argues that games are interfaces that enable cognitive and social learning. They are training devices in some sense, what developmental psychologists view as the reason for play, and so the abilities they test us on are the ultimate meaning of a game. Go is about strategic foresight and expression, poker is about deception, yomi, and calling other people's bluffs, and Settlers of Catan is about the management of resources in a constructive diplomatic way. Games that use chance or uncertainty are encoding a value about how we should respond to random events and how we should be creative as well. In essence, the skills you have to show to succeed at a game are ultimately, in the meta, what the game is about. Immersive sims that encourage you to play with systems are in some sense about creativity, and games that require memorization are about our faculty for recall. Narrative-based games may not be about skill in the classical sense, but they test us on other domains, like our interpretation and understanding of themes like hope, love, and redemption. The Civilization series is about warfare and conquest in its fiction, but it encodes different meanings at different levels. It can be read as a rags-to-riches story from the perspective of a society in its ludic interface, but there are meanings encoded there too. It encodes the fact that progress is inherently good. It encodes that the way to progress is resources, an army, and diplomatic leverage, and it encodes that the causes of history are all exogenous, or caused by elements outside the system itself, not driven by its own materiality. It's strange, but Marx's historical materialism, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel, and more recent forays into a theory of history, including Kenneth Pomeranz, Ian Morris, and people who reject the idea of a grand historical meta-narrative all become relevant here. The system's victory conditions and context all change the meaning. However, when we get to the psychological level, Civilization is about, in Sid Meier's own words, a series of interesting decisions. It's testing us on creativity, planning, optimization, resource management, and our diplomatic acumen, as well as our ability to manage short-term, long-term risk-reward decisions and anticipate the moves of our opponents. What I feel we need to master is the ability to move between these levels of resolution and intentionally create harmony or disharmony based on what we are trying to accomplish in a game. The simple verbs we use encode meanings. A game like Gears of War tells us we can solve problems with violence, whereas Flower tells us we can solve problems with unity, beauty, cooperation, and reconciliation. Games like Eco and Journey harmonize the theme with the mechanics at multiple levels, but others intentionally create dissonance to highlight the artificiality of the medium or to split us from the intentions of our avatar. The Unfinished Swan is about subtractive art, so it makes you subtract from the environment to create a path. Thumper is about breaking the rules of music, so it uses game feel to incentivize you to destroy the beat yourself. And What Remains of Edith Finch has a level where you're torn between the mundanity of reality and the spatial interface of games, highlighting the duality between reality and fiction that lies at the heart of all games. In my estimation, all games are ultimately what Jasper Ewell calls half-real, and this perfectly highlights the metaphor intrinsic to games. They are trapped between two worlds, which is why it is extremely difficult to devise metaphors through mechanics, because they fundamentally exist in multiple universes. Games are about story, games are about escapism, but ultimately, games are about play, and Brian Sutton Smith's seminal book, The Ambiguity of Play, captures why this remains confusing. Once we have a general understanding of the parity between art, play, and systems, as well as a robust vocabulary of the meanings that can exist at multiple resolutions, I'm certain there are an infinite universe of possibilities we can explore when it comes to conveying meaning through interactivity. Thank you for watching, everyone. I mean it when I say I would love to see a library of meaningful mechanics pop up. So if you have any examples you can think of in a game that uses mechanics, systems, space, framing, or any other tool I've highlighted to convey any meaning at all, please leave them in the comments below. I'd love to harness the distributed knowledge of the gaming community to come up with a database of ideas, so here's your chance to contribute. Anyway, thanks again, subscribe and like if you want to support the channel, and I will see you guys next time.